Okay, so this section right here, we're going to talk about really the newest manufacturing trend, or one of the newer manufacturing trends, which is reshoring. And let's talk a little bit about shoring, if you will, because there's a bunch of different terms out there. Reshoring is bringing jobs back that were offshored, bringing them back to the U.S. in this case. That would be the home country. So the same thing would apply to Adidas bringing jobs from China back to Germany. It's exactly the same thing. You're bringing it back to where it left from. That's reshoring. New shoring, which is a relatively newer term, is creating the jobs in the home country from scratch. So you're not looking at offshore, or you did look at offshore, but you decided that you wanted to do it here. That's called new shoring. And then nearshoring is when you bring it back to, for example, Canada or Mexico would be nearshoring. So automobile companies, as you know, have nearshored a significant part of the automobile production is in Mexico, and there's significant production in Canada too. So that's called nearshoring when they do that. And then offshoring is, of course, taking it overseas into a different geographical region. So those are the kind of the terminology here. Now, none of this has anything to do with the cases that you're going to be studying. So I'll be perfectly clear about that. What I'm trying to do again is kind of linking some of the current trends in these segments to current strategy. And so that's what we're trying to do here. So again, we have offshore, nearshore, new shore, reshore. And all these have different meanings, different applications, and mean different things. But offshoring started in the 60s. It pretty well peaked in the late 70s. And it's clear that over time, the primary reason for the offshoring was chasing the low-cost country labor rate and the low-cost country piece rate compared to what they could get, compared to what was available here in the United States. And again, I'll talk about the U.S., but you could substitute any country you want. You could substitute France, the UK, Germany, Canada. It doesn't matter. And now you're even seeing China offshore to Vietnam. Certain types, that'd be probably nearshoring, but are nearshoring over to Vietnam right now. So it's a whole idea of non-domestic manufacturing. Okay, so what the literature is showing, and what not only the literature but what practical experience is showing, is that the decision to go there was based on limited parameters, and over time, much of that advantage has been eroded. And so companies are looking at, because of the extended supply chain, because of risk, and if you keep in mind that risk is including intellectual property. So sharing IP with foreign suppliers is risky. It's not that every supplier is risky, but it's risky. And if you look at some of the big brand names and the fact that they've seen counterfeits go up dramatically on name brand retail items, and so they've basically Amazon has banned them from being resold on their site. So I mean, there's an awareness and a strategic reason why you would reshore. And again, a lot of this is because the cost factors that went into it were not extended enough or expansive enough to really measure the impact on it. And the other thing is that once you got into it, you found out, once you started to look at some of the productivity measurements, that it wasn't nearly as productive or as cost advantageous as what you might have thought. And I'll show you that here in just a second. And there's always the issue now, you have a longer lead time. So customer service, your ability to adapt, your ability to respond has been diminished. And so companies are thinking about it and are looking at it, but at the same time, they're not just looking at that mutually exclusively. So we'll talk about that in just a second, but that's kind of the framework here. So let me just give you an example of when you look at cost. One thing that didn't really get factored into a lot of these decisions to offshore, and that's this, and that is that because of the competition for labor in China, we've seen the manufacturing wages go up dramatically on a per hour basis. And when you adjust it for productivity, you can see here that what you're looking at is that in the last 12 years now, the rate is roughly equal to Mexico. So on a productivity basis, productivity adjusted basis, you're looking at you're back to rates of just having it across the border, and China now is much higher than Vietnam and India in terms of productivity adjusted. So if you look at it from a productivity adjusted basis, then that's one way to look at it. That tells you that it's probably, if you went there for that reason, it's probably worth looking at it again and trading it off against your inventory levels, against your service levels, and all the other things that we know from supply chain that need to go into that. So these are real numbers, and it may not be real for your company, but I would encourage you to look at it and say, when's the last time we looked at it? And we look at Brazil. Brazil jumped 25% over the same period. So there's a limited workforce there, and that brings pressure on wages, and wages go up, and then you have the impact of the dollar and the conversion into the dollar, and that works against you as well too. So if you're dollar denominated, then you have some additional pressures on top of that. And companies now are looking for the engineering and technical skills. And the reality of it is that even in these developing economies, there's still relatively few of those people out there. So it's hard to find people, hire, train, and then retaining them. So we need productivity to offset all this. And again, the evidence is productivity and this level of training in country, in the offshore country, is very hard to do. And that was another trend, is that many multinational companies, corporations, MNCs, would go overseas for engineers because the engineers were actually educated here in the States and then went home after their education. So they were certainly well trained and very, very capable people. But realistically, they would go there, and there's only whatever that number is. There just simply isn't enough of them for the multinational corporations to continue to make that investment, to actually make that foreign investment. So you start to couple a couple things. When you start to hook a couple of these things together, you start to get a little different picture on what the real opportunity is. So why did it occur? Well, one was the strengthening of the dollar. So I'm not going to read this because you can read it. You're all pretty familiar with it. I don't think there's anything in here that is new, other than just a couple of things. One, the growth of robotics is into advanced manufacturing is really changing the dynamic around here in the U.S. And there's lots of evidence that this is being very successful, and this creates this rise in productivity. So all of a sudden you can offset the labor with automated with advanced manufacturing, and from a total cost perspective, then all of a sudden it turns profitable because you can capitalize things that you had to expense before. And very reliable, can work, a robot can work a lot longer and not necessarily smarter, not necessarily as productive as a human, but over a period of time, but has certainly contributed to productivity increases. And what we're starting to look and see is what we call cobots, where we have both humans and robots, where the robots do the repetitive jobs, the heavy lifting, if you will, but they're doing the repetitive jobs, and then the humans are doing the non-repetitive jobs. So these are some of the reasons why things were going the way they were. And again, we have technology here. We have technology here. Also, one of the things that you'll see is that demand in the developed economies has slowed down dramatically. When you think of Europe, for example, it's slowed down dramatically. So all of a sudden, you have less reason to be overseas if your demand in those markets is not extensive. So when it was, people went overseas dramatic, in a significant way. But as you're going to see, they're not. It's the trend is to reshore, but not necessarily close the previously offshored plant. We'll talk about that. Okay. So as output, the brown line right here, this is the U.S. over time through 14, through the end of 14. You can see China has done well. If we looked at this through 16, it would have leveled. It would have probably dropped a little bit, and this would have probably continued to inch up a little bit, and this will probably be fairly flat. But you can see in terms of the slope. The other, Germany, UK, and France took it much harder. The jobs that went overseas, probably the jobs that come back are not the jobs that were off-sourced. I think that's one of the key messages, is that the jobs that are being reshored are not the same jobs that were offshored initially, and there won't be as many of them. So that's going to be a dynamic that's going to be out there and is impacting GDP here, and also impacting a fair number of people. So let's take a look at it. Well, what it does is obviously it reduces domestic output, and then thus employment. So where you have labor costs is the majority of the cost, then it becomes quite vulnerable to offshoring. Services, on the other hand, have not been particularly offshore. We have exported services, and we've done so very well, and we have a positive balance of trade in services. Capital-intensive industries would be prime candidates, and support services. I've had a call center in the Philippines before. I've had a call center in India. I've had an engineering center in the Philippines. I've had IT in India. So these are things that are routine now, and you don't think about it like you did before, because you're connected by technology and you don't lose a thing. But as we've seen, the U.S. economy has been refocused towards services. So we've moved away from things, we moved to services. So instead of buying a car, the service is Uber. Instead of going to the brick and mortar store, the service is Amazon. So that's where we're going, moving away from that and moving into the services arena, which is also the whole arena around convenience. So the current environment, this is where we want to talk about this, is that offshore has been stabilized. It's stabilizing quite a bit. And reshoring and nearshoring, that is, like I said, Canada and Mexico, and bringing it back to the United States for whatever purposes, is gaining. This is from Boston Consulting Group. It's a 2015 study. So one of the things we found is not only was productivity affected, but the other thing is that the distance between manufacturing, engineering, design, and quality became an issue. And this gets back into the whole management of IP, gets back to management of implementation of complex designs. And so this became kind of a problem. The ability to do pre-market introductions was much harder to do. So anyway, this became an issue. Now, U.S. manufacturing has come back. There has been a there have been jobs that have come back. There's been 1 million jobs that have come back out of the 2.3 that left, or were forecasted to leave. But the jobs that are coming back, it's going to take a lot longer to get those back, and some of those, as I said, are not going to come back at all. And while the manufacturing category may come back, the jobs that were supporting it before it was offshore will not come back. It's going to be probably heavily weighed down by advanced manufacturing. So we know productivity gains affect job growth. It also affects the ability to bring it back, and so that's why we're going to see it that way. And manufacturing, like everything else, is moving closer to GDP. So as people move to cities, manufacturing moves to cities, distribution moves to cities, and the same is true all over the world. I mean, manufacturing wants to be where GDP is, and so this is the trend. So as China moves into 30 or 40 mega cities of 30 to 40 million people, then the manufacturing is going to move to around that. So here's the caveat. The caveat is that while we are reshoring, the companies are continuing to offshore. And the reason for that is very simple, is that they now have a demand, this GDP, they have a demand in a developing country that wasn't there before, that needs to be satisfied. So what's going to happen is that the plant that was building those products in the foreign country will now be building them for domestic capacity. So in essence, bringing goods back, the domestic capacity side of it will be additive. So this is when you see exports dropping, that's not necessarily the same thing as saying GDP is dropping. For example, Daimler-Benz built a plant in Alabama. So exports from Germany to the U.S. from Daimler-Benz dropped. And the same thing would be true for other types of companies that are now seeing enough of a domestic market, which is primarily in China, and India is the other one, that once it hits its stride, there's going to be capacity issues in China, because there's just simply not enough capacity now to support a Chinese middle class, which would be bigger than the entire population of the United States. So it's a very difficult situation we're in now. And I think the other thing is that just because of some natural disasters, ones we saw, the Japanese earthquake of 14, the Thailand tsunami we saw, realistically, you don't want to have all your plants in one place. You want to have a geographical presence and a geographical concentration. So, or a geographical diversification. So you want to be where the GDP is. You want to have products that are specific to that market, that are on a standard platform. And so this is the case, is that we're still seeing companies moving offshore, but we're seeing them either keep and do new shoring here, or near shoring, or bringing it back, whichever it is. So there's many examples of that. So that's what's going on. So reshored production is being offset by offshoring within the same firm, because there's some things that can and should be from a total cost perspective done like that. But a lot of things can affect that, can't they? What are those kinds of things that really affect location? Here's the kinds of things. This is from A.T. Kearney. It's a 2015 study on foreign direct investment. And what they're saying is, as I said, as we talked about, domestic market size is the number one thing for where and why do you make an investment in a foreign country. So domestic market size. So as these markets, as these developing countries, the BRIC countries, grow their domestic markets, and certainly China and India are bigger than Brazil and Russia by a huge factor. In fact, I saw something the other day that Brazil's GDP is equal to Russia's GDP. So that was a surprise to me. I hadn't thought about that. But anyway, when you look at the domestic market size, you can see that 25% of the companies say, hey, yeah, that's I want to be there. That supports that previous trend, okay? Government regulations and lack of corruption, tax rates and ease of payment. Well, you've all read about that's not exactly, tax rates are not exactly the U.S. forte. So compared to the rest of the world, so that's a problem. But you can look at the color of the bars here and you get an idea as to, how many are what color. And you can kind of look at this and sort of see, yeah, labor is expensive, but again, you have to look at it from a holistic standpoint, and that's what we do when we get into total cost of ownership. We look at it we look at it in a much broader way than typical models do. So what are the drivers? So the drivers of this is that labor cost, overseas labor cost is going up, energy cost is going up, the currency exchange factor is huge now. Those of you may recall, not too long ago, I guess it was the summer of 15, I think, is when the RMB, the Chinese currency, was devalued dramatically, and some of the procurement contracts for contract suppliers were based on the rate that the buyer would pay was based on the RMB exchange rate to the U.S. dollar. So when it went down, then those contracts got reopened and renegotiated, or were adjusted accordingly. So I don't know how many of you guys had contracts that had that same kind of a clause in it, or that kind of a de-escalator or an escalator, but that's currency exchange is a big deal. And as the Fed is the only bank, is the only national bank raising rates, it's going to make the dollar more expensive. So if you're dollar denominated, you better be thinking about that. Shipping time, obviously, and the trade-off is inventory. Credit, particularly the availability of credit if you are a small or medium-sized enterprise that is less than 500 million in turnover. The cost of credit can get very high for overseas investment. So this could be a reason to keep it back. You want to stay close to your customers. Story after story and case after case of companies that said, I want to be close to my suppliers and I want to be close to my customers. So they made that a strategic decision and they've done extremely well with it. One of the companies that did that's a company called Big Ass Fan. And probably all of you are familiar with Big Ass Fan, and it's exactly what it says it is. That's exactly the decision they made. They said they wanted to be close to their supplier group. They wanted to be close to their customers. So they decided, even though it would have been somewhat cheaper to take it overseas and bring it back, that's not what their strategy was. So, again, models don't do that for you. You have to work that out within the firm. So this is IP, we spoke about that. Product differentiation, we're more customer focused than basically any economy in the world. So we create new innovations and we create differentiations faster because our culture and our economy is driven by that. That is what the US does very well. It innovates and it differentiates. And that's not the norm in many other countries in the world. So this is a driver to bring it back because then you can benefit from all of this. So manufacturing's importance. One of the things that you need to keep in mind is that when factories are nearshored, that is, they are brought into Canada or Mexico, the U.S. content in those factories goes way up. So that is it's an export, but it's a very, very positive. It's a very big positive in nearshoring. So you can bring it to Mexico, but a lot of your suppliers will be in the States, not in Mexico. And so you'll be getting things from the States or from Canada or wherever. And that's a real plus in this overall picture. Even though the assembly jobs didn't come back, the components and the assemblies and the raw materials will come to have a very high U.S. content. So there is some fallout from that that gets understated in this whole mix. And I think the other thing is this is what it says too, is that the small and medium enterprises that went overseas are the ones that are basically coming back for many of these reasons. So they're not really geared up to deal with this, and to the extent that the large companies are, and even the large companies are making some moves as well too. So give you an idea. This is a Chinese company that actually came into the States because from their perspective, when they looked at those same drivers, they said, hey, we have a big market here. We need to be there. Likewise, there's a big market for US companies in China, and now they say we need to be there too for the Chinese economy, not for the US economy, but for the Chinese economy. So what are the barriers? Well, labor costs is definitely a barrier, but when you adjust it by productivity, then it becomes less of a barrier. But it's only one input, and that's the other thing. So it's a barrier, but it's one input. Here's the other input: the tax structures. The taxes here are on businesses are generally higher than they are in most other countries. The infrastructure is under pressure. Transportation infrastructure is under some serious stress right now, and particularly with capacity, we're in overcapacity in most modes. So this is a big deal. The roads are not in great shape. The bridges are even in worse shape, and the airline capacity is pretty much constrained by what we currently have. There's not a lot of growth in that because there's been no infrastructure investment in it. Pipelines are under stress from government intervention and just the green movement against all fossil fuels. So that's hurting. So we need more STEM students. As I said before, we need more STEM students. So if you're in those categories, good for you. Political climate, well, right now we won't make any comments on which way to go, but the political climate is, as you know, is not conducive to necessarily bringing things back because we're unsure as to what's going to happen. And the business climate revolves around environmental regulations, which under the current administration have been pretty difficult and constraining to business growth. There's a group. You can go to this website, reshoringinitiative.org. You can take a look at it. We're going to use their template. We're just going to review their template quickly on total cost. But here's the benefits that they've outlined. Clearly, if you bring it back, it's going to help in GDP growth. You can look at trade and budgets. Unemployment by creating productive jobs, but the problem is the skill set. The jobs that are coming back are not the jobs that left. So we need someone who's comfortable with technology, and we need to train the people who want to be in those kinds of jobs. So we don't need to go through this one by one, but you can see that this is what they claim are the benefits of reshoring. Okay, so according to Boston Consulting, you're seeing that because of the climate here, because of the political climate and the government structure we have, and the markets that we have, that the U.S. is now becoming more preferential as the place to locate. Our economies are growing. Most every other economy is slow to slowing. So that's good. That's why Daimler's here. That's why Toyota's here. That's why other companies are here, because there's a market for their products, and it's much less costly to make them here. So when we look at things to evaluate, when we think about manufacturing locations, we look at these kinds of things. This is the kind of stuff you're going to model. You're going to model weight. You're going to model you're going to model your inbound all the way through your outbound. You're not necessarily going to model currency stability, but you need to keep that in mind. You have to put in a cost of moving it back. Make sure that you have the local management, that you have a demographic that's going to support the labor that you need, that you have a stability in that labor, and you have the training in that labor. So these are just a few things that you would look at in terms of evaluating. And when we go to the next thing, it's exactly the same thing. We're going to be looking at these two. So specific factors on reshoring around transportation and logistics. Do we have knowledgeable transportation intermediaries, your MVOCC, your freight forwarders, your integrated carriers? Do they have are they working closely with the carriers and with the suppliers and contract manufacturers? Do they have the right footprint to do all this? And understanding all this. This is very important. Do we have the availability? Well, right now we have lots of availability. We have overcapacity. That will change in the next over the next between now and the end of 17. Are costs stable? No, costs are not stable. Fuel surcharges are up and down. They were very high in terms of fuel, was running 30–40% over and above as a percent of your freight charge, and now it's down quite a bit. So the issue is that what are you going to use to model a longer term decision? Do you believe that fuel costs are going to be $40 a barrel in 2025? That's really what you're looking at, because it's going to take you years to bring some of this back and bring it online. And if you're betting on fuel as being what's going to pay the bill and make this worthwhile, then you have to commit to yourself that, yeah, we think in 2025, the fuel costs are going to be down. So this is some things that impact us, and you'll see this again when we talk about it. And the same with customers. Do we think that there's a chance? This is a risk factor. Do we think there's a chance of a natural disaster, such as an earthquake in Toyota, or a safety disaster like the port blowing up in Japan or in China too? You know, that shut down that port. Do we think that Hurricane Matthew is going to occur, which shut down Savannah? So what do we think about that? Do we believe that the Gulf ports from Houston over to Mobile, Alabama are going to be underwater by 2050 because of melting ice? Because some people say they will. So if that's the case, do you believe that? And are you willing to commit to that? Do you have regional suppliers? What are you looking at in terms of activism, military activism? Can you build a local market? So these are all issues that kind of go into it. And certainly, what are your competitors doing? And depending on the industry and you're in, your competitors are doing different things. So you need to know that. And that's the kind of thing that you have to do when you're building these models on reshoring. Okay, and then these are the traditional ones you look at. You look at uncertainty. You look at all these. I'm not going to go over them, but you can see it. In terms of environmental factors that again should be factored into a total cost analysis. So this is a map from it's called CHIPS. It's from the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. It's color-coded maps that's showing risk is in dark red. Higher if you're sourcing from Russia or you're sourcing from Argentina, you're looking at, or Uruguay, you're looking at, a very high risk of relative to your supply base. And if you're in the green, obviously you're not. So I think this is Q4 2015. You can get this online by just looking this up. Yeah, Q4 2015. So this is I'm sure there's some more out. This is one that I've got. And you can look at the purchasing risks. You can see China's coded yellow, South Africa is yellow, India is yellow. So here's the BRICS: Brazil, South Africa, Russia's red, China, and India. So this is a good indication. It's just another data point. It's just another data point in the overall thing that you're going to want to look at. So let's look at the reshoring question. Again, we ask us, if you're going to build a model based on any of those environmental factors, then you've got to think: is this going to, how stable is this? Is it going to potentially be disruptive? Am I going to get the ROI on this, or am I not going to get the ROI? And in some cases, there's companies that would have a strong case to reshore, but they haven't done it. And that's because they're looking at some of these factors like this, and they're saying, no, we're not comfortable with all this. So it's not just a labor versus labor trade-off. Exactly what I said. What conditions? Scenario planning is you test the scenario and you look at it. So for example, if you look at energy, if energy is the top variable, will they stay low or will they go back to the pre-fracking levels, which were $100 a barrel? So that is a huge variable if that's one of the drivers in your industry. So China is still growing at 7%. It seems to be fixed at 7%, but we're projecting at 3%. So international trade will grow on pace with GDP. Indications are general, it's not. It should grow actually at a rate of 1.5 GDP. That's the historical rate, and now it's growing at half that. So we're not seeing this now. So what does that do to your model when you look at the total cost? And do you reshore or nearshore or whatever, new shore? So meanwhile, China, which right now is 14% of global GDP compared to the US, which is 25%, they're expecting by 2025 that China will be 20%, which is primarily the growth in their middle class, and the US will be 20%. So this will be monumental if it actually occurs. And they're saying that the developing countries, primarily India and China, will exceed Western Europe's GDP by 2022. And India is a driver of that because India's growth rate exceeds China because of the fact that they're starting to loosen regulation now as they have 1 billion people and growing. They can't continue to have a closed society or a closed economic society as they've had. The other thing is trading blocks, and companies are aligning. Countries are aligning. They're making decisions. So if TPP does not go down, those countries are going to align with China because they have to have trade. So it's not, you can do bilateral trade agreements, and that could very well be the outcome of that. But there's some advantages to trading blocks and taking advantage of them. As you know, Europe just signed an agreement with Canada. They don't have an agreement with the US. The UK will have to do its own agreements with everyone when they leave the EU. So what we're going to look at is this is what I said before, is that the domestic manufacturing capacity in the BRIC countries or in the developing countries are going to be used to satisfy domestic markets. So where are you going to get that capacity? That's the question. And I don't think you can presume that if you accept this, you can't presume that you're going to get capacity where it is today. So the factories that you have in Asia today or Vietnam or wherever you have them, what happens if they're not there and there is no capacity to be there? What's the right answer? And that's the risk assessment, and that then may drive a decision. Mexico is looking very good. Vietnam is looking very good, and India is looking promising right now. Mexico has staged a huge comeback right now, and the quality coming out of Mexico is very high. Obviously, there's a north-south corridor in Mexico into the United States, very developed, very well established, and again, your supplier base kind of transfers up to the U.S. for more of the sophisticated type components and assemblies. Vietnam is definitely where China is taking its capacity when they look at different kinds of capacities. China's taken the capacity down to Vietnam for some of the more basic things, and India, as I said, is loosening the regulation. So that's what that is. And so the big issue is that is the company ready to reshore? Do you have the capacity to do so? Do you have the advanced manufacturing to do so? Do you have the people to manage the advanced manufacturing? Do you have those skills? And what do you need to pull it all together and make it happen? So most companies are looking at, when they choose a location, they're looking at, is the skilled labor available? Is the supply chain system available? The ecosystem available? And is the government willing to work with me on this investment? Those are the three key things that go into any location decision, whether it's to reshore, nearshore, new shore, or offshore. So at the end of the day, what are we looking at? It was manufacturing has historically been done by cost-based thinking around transportation and labor and materials, but the reality of it is that in today's marketplace, those are inputs, but the real thing is customer service and your ability to serve a customer in a convenient way, and then you have to manage the costs back and forth. So you've got to come up with a solution that is superior or equal to your competitors, and then you're just competing on price. But you have to have a better experience than your competitor. The research shows that that consumers, first of all, they assume pricing is pretty well leveled because of the internet. So the other thing is we found is that offshore manufacturing does not guarantee the total lowest cost over time. So when you look at the costs, then you compare that to what your customers and your supplier considerations are, it may cost you more, but at the end of the day, your productivity may be up and your quality may be up, so your market may be up. And there's plenty of cases to show that's what happens. And then this whole issue around supplier relationship, which is that your suppliers are a source of knowledge. That's the whole idea around relationships, is use your suppliers, use their experience, use their innovation to help your product be differentiated and better than the other one. Last slide is this. It's not simple. It's very difficult to do, and you'll see this in just a second with this total cost matrix we're going to go over. It takes a lot of extensive analysis. It's not a data point. It requires input from your senior management team from all aspects of your organization. You've got to include you have to include all the stakeholders in this. And you have to realize that if you do decide to do it, it's just not as simple as I'm just going to move it back. That in many countries, many foreign countries, you have to have permission to leave. So, and it comes at a cost. And even here, the government, the U.S. government, is trying to put a cost on leaving here too. So you have to have permission. There's exit taxes. There's issues around removing equipment and moving it. You may not be able to do that. Or if you do, you may pay duties and taxes on it if you do. You have to end contracts. You have a number of things that happen in a lot of these countries. And if you don't follow it, you may not be able to operate in that country at all. If you're in non-compliance with an exit rule, you may not be able to actually operate or sell in that country going forward. So it's a very individual decision, it's a very individual fit, and it's very complicated. So we're going to stop with this, and then we're going to come back with total cost of ownership.